If you were listening to music in a Baptist church in the mid-1980s, then you probably remember a song called Pass It On. Okay, good. I had to I texted Brad this week to ask, was it just my church where I grew up where this was just like a constant banger? Like we were always playing Pass It On. If you're not familiar, it's the most memorable part of it to me is it only takes a spark to get a fire going, and then all those who are around can, I don't remember from there. Something about it's glowing. Some of you know the words. Yeah, it's glowing, and I knew Brad would. All right. So yeah, it just describes how, it only takes a spark, and it says that's how it is with God's love once you've experienced it, that you want the world, you want to share it. And honestly, I remember it, but sometimes I get it and the lyrics to Starlight Express kind of combined in my head, and I start one and finish the other. But it has stuck with me so powerfully, this idea that it only takes a spark to get a fire going, which is so often true. We can see that in like forest fires and situations, like that. In fact, I find it's usually the case that it just kind of takes a spark unless you want to start a fire. Like if you're camping and it's cold, then it takes way more than you have with you. Like it takes like a gallon of diesel to get a fire going at that point. But it says it only takes a spark. But the reality is that it takes really four things to make a fire. It doesn't just take a spark. That spark is ignition. But there are three other things. It takes oxygen, right? The fire has to breathe. It takes a fuel source. There has to be something there to burn. And it takes heat. There has to be a certain amount of heat ambient to what's, the environment for a fire to light. And there are, if you read through the website of the Department of Forestry Management, you can see that there are, instances where they kind of use all of these things. Where if there was a fire to break out somewhere in the church building, that we would look for one of these little red cylinders on the wall. And of course, I don't see one in this room right now. But we would look for, there's one back there in the entryway. We would look for a red cylinder, and we would spray that fire down, and it would basically keep all the oxygen off of the fire. It would smother the fire, and that's how it would kill it. We wouldn't say, let's make it cold. Somebody turn the air down, and that will start. No, we would smother it. So there's that. You take away the oxygen source. Forestry management, they will have controlled burns to try to get rid of some of the fuel. There are some places where they'll send goats through the forest, which sounds like such a fun job. To just chase goats through the woods, right? Somebody has that on their resume. I'm a goat chaser, right? And so they'll send goats through, and the goats will sort of eat up all the fuel so that forest fires are less likely to happen. So when we consider fire, the reason I bring this up today is that you and I have probably had the experience, maybe not of seeing a forest fire or even seeing the devastation of a home fire, but I tell you a fire that we have seen. You've probably seen someone lose their temper. You've probably seen somebody lose their temper. And I would say that when someone loses their temper, that it's not just the spark. Right? There's not just that ignition point. There's other things going on. There has to be some oxygen that has caused this, to be able to breathe. There has to be some distance that's created this. There has to have been some heat. In fact, I see a lot of times that the heat that I see when people start to lose their temper is a lot of times they'll say that they hadn't gotten a good night's sleep the night before. That can certainly heat up a relational situation when you haven't gotten sleep. Or maybe you're hungry, right? You're hungry. And it's like, just don't talk to me until I've had a Snickers or something. All right, or maybe just your boss at work was just awful. Right? Your boss at work was awful, and so you come home and you're not really kind to your spouse, or you kick the dog. Right? It's like, because you're angry with the boss, and the dog hasn't done anything wrong, and the dog's going to forgive you. So, right? And so there's these other things that sort of add heat into your relationship, that put heat into to your personality, and then there's the fuel. And sometimes in relationship, we let that fuel kind of pile up. We let that fuel kind of pile up and pile up and pile up, and all of a sudden, the way he does the toothpaste tube is just too much to bear. And you say, why do you squeeze it from the middle? And he says, I don't know, it's just this fancy toothpaste. I squeeze it from the middle, but then the next morning when I get here, it's all settled back down to the end of the tube. It's just the fancy tooth. And you say, it hasn't settled back to the end of the tube. I put it inside of a drawer, and I close the drawer on it, and I like a squeegee pincer thing to make it all go down there. You think that it's just magically appearing at the bottom of the tube, and you're fighting over toothpaste. But you're not. It's all that other stuff. It's that other fuel that you've sort of been stacking up and stacking up and stacking up, but then there's that spark. And then the fire starts going. The scriptures are full of places, like from beginning to end, of instances where God in his wisdom says that we are to be careful how we deal with our anger. See, God has given us, he's put inside of us these powerful emotions that they have power in us because God has put us into an environment where we need to respond. Within our environment, within the context of relationships and community, we need to respond. And the thing that oftentimes will get us to respond is not cold logic, it isn't sound reason, it is that emotion. It is that emotion inside us that will finally push us to do something, to act even when it may lead to our own harm. Because there are people who rush into burning buildings. And I don't think, like Kyle here, he rushes into burning buildings to save people. And I don't think that it's just a cold calculation in his head. It's not just training. It's not just because he gets a paycheck. But there is something here. So there's some emotion there that says there are people that need my help. He goes. And so God has given us these powerful emotions, and he's given us the word. And the wisdom of God's word is to help us to harness those emotions. And so today I want to talk a little bit about how in the book of Proverbs we see that Solomon is pushing us in the direction of how to have emotions, but for us to harness them for good instead of letting them be harnessed for evil. The first thing that I think we have to see when we consider our anger is that we have to be careful with the spark. We have to be careful with that spark. Proverbs 14, verse 29 is where I'll begin this morning. And each of these Proverbs, the past few weeks I've been going through these Proverbs, and each of them is packed with wisdom. And I've been pulling out individual verses here and there, but I would encourage you, go back and spend some time in each of these chapters to read more of the context here. But 14:29 says, whoever is slow to anger has great understanding, but he who has a hasty temper exalts folly. This idea of being slow to anger, it's that there is a spark there is a spark that might ignite a flame, but they hold off. They hold off. They're going to be slow to anger, not quick to it, but slow. The word that is used there, the word for anger in Hebrew, it sounds like this. It's af, right? It literally means to make a long face. To make a long face. And some scholars have said it's almost as if they made the word based on the sound you make when you're angry but under control. Instead of it being like like this, which a lot of Hebrew words have this like kind of a guttural stuff. It's not that. It's child, you are on my last nerve. I am warning you. That sort of thing. Or it's where you're driving and you see those Oklahoma license plates and you know they're about to cut you off for no reason. Right? It's this calming that takes over. There's a reason for anger there. There's cause for anger, but instead of clenching your jaw and showing your teeth, you're going to make a long face. You're going to take your time. You're going to exhale. And that if we do this, if we can do this, that it provides us with great understanding. Now I'm going to say something that you don't want to hear any more than I want to say it. What I'm about to say is going to displease both of us, me as the speaker of it and you as the recipient. But I feel I have to say it, even though I don't like saying it. But here it is. Sometimes God works in ways that make us angry. I don't like it, and you don't like it. But sometimes there are things that God is doing that are going to make us angry. Romans 8:28 tells us that God is working all things together for good. And that is an ultimate good. That is a godly good. That is a heaven perspective of good. It isn't our perspective of good. It isn't always our perspective of good. So that person that cuts you off in traffic and makes you late was for your good. That person that backed into you and damaged your car was good. That relationship that got severed, there's good in that. That person that you lost, the person that you put into the ground, that you committed their body to the earth way before you were ready. Somehow, God has good in that. And you may go through a season of sadness. You go through a season of sort of all of those phases of loss. And there is inside of there still this, sometimes I think maybe that grain of anger is harder to get rid of than anything else. Because you can be resigned to God and His control. And you can say, God is sovereign. He is watching over all of this. And still there can still be this like little grain, this little pebble of anger inside of there. That when you start talking about it, you kind of have to just stop talking about it. And if you find yourself there, if you can make the long face. God's in control. God's in control of this. That God is working in the midst of these things that make me angry in ways that I don't understand, through things that I can't see, and still He's working. I don't know if you've ever seen a passion play, the story of Jesus and the crucifixion, resurrection. I remember the first time I saw a passion play, I saw one in my home church where I grew up, and they did a great job, and all these people are dressed in these costumes, and I remember a man who was my Sunday school teacher, Charlie McCarley. Love Charlie. Charlie McCarley. He was one of the people who yelled, I'm going to move my crucify him! And he was so passionate about it. And it made me so angry. It made me so angry and I understood, I was old enough to understand this is a play, this is pretend, but at the same time I knew that there were real people that really shouted to crucify Jesus, and it made me angry. And I'll just tell you, a lot of times when I think about the cross, I get angry about it because He didn't deserve it. Because He didn't deserve it. A lot of other people, go with crucifixion. He alone did not deserve to pay the penalty of unrighteousness, and yet He did. And there's a part of it that makes me angry about it, even though I love it, even though I need it, even though I wake up with it and celebrate it every day. There's still a little bit of it makes me angry that people would shout to crucify Him. That was God's plan. It was God's plan. And humanity didn't see God's plan unfolding. The people who were there, who were present, the disciples who are hearing these things and in this tumultuous season are fleeing away from Jesus. And those who are still nearby are sort of in hiding, watching from some distance. They didn't understand the things that were happening all around them. And there was probably some anger about it. But God had a plan, and his plan was for good. And so we have to be careful with that spark. We have to be careful not to let our anger spark, because we need to recognize that God has a larger plan. And if we take time to sit with our anger, then we can get a chance to see problems in the light of his larger plan. The second thing that I think we have to do if we're going to deal with this passion that we have is that we have to bring down the heat. We have to be careful not to spark, but we also have to bring down the heat. Proverbs 15:18 says this. It says, a hot-tempered man stirs up strife, but he who is slow to anger quiets contention. A hot-tempered man. See, that isn't so much talking about the circumstances. That isn't so much talking about the circumstances. That's talking about the temperature of the person involved. That there are people that are hot-tempered. People are hot-tempered. And so I think an important question for us, an important question for self-reflection is, what are you hot about? Maybe right now you're like, I'm not hot about anything. I'm sitting in church, having a nice time. I got a donut earlier, looking forward to lunch. I got no reason to be hot. All right, so that's good. I'm glad that you're not hot right now. What are the things that make you hot? What are the things that make you hot? Have you ever watched a videotape of the Cowboys lose? No. I don't mean a tape of the Cowboys losing. I mean, have you ever seen a videotape of you when the Cowboys lose? Yeah. Some of us, we get really passionate about that, and we'll say things about Dak Prescott that we may regret on Monday morning. And we say, why can Mahomes win a game in 14 seconds and Dak can't get off one single snap in 14 seconds? And we might even send a fiery email to Jerry Jones to say, hey, I got to stop right now. I got to stop now. What are the things that make you hot? It's probably not the Cowboys. And maybe that's a silly example, but there's something to that, isn't there? There are things that are going to make you hot. There are things that raise your temperature. There are things that just generally raise the temperature around everything else. And if you and I aren't aware of those things that make us hot, if we're not aware of that context in which our blood starts to kind of, maybe not boil, but simmer. If we're not aware of those, then when that spark comes, we're much more likely to set fire. We're much more likely to set fire. So let us be aware of the things that we get hot about. Take your temperature. Take your spouse's temperature. Take your friend's temperature with their permission, how about that? Let's try it that way. Invite your spouse to take your temperature. Maybe today over lunch say, Pastor Chip, he's so silly. I don't get hot about anything, right? Or maybe, Pastor said that about getting hot in situations, that there are things that make it. Do you see anything where I get that way about it? And, you might be like, well, honey, I've been meaning to talk to you about the toothpaste, right? I don't know what it is. But whatever it is, in your relationship, find out where it is, where you get hot, so that you can be in control, so that you can be slow to anger. Because the promise here on the other side of this proverb is powerful. That he who is slow to anger quiets contention. It's a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing because we live in a world where it seems like, especially when we look at like our online engagements, the way that people connect on the internet through social media, that there is a lot of contention. I hate to break this to you, but we're about to have another political election in our country. And Lord, help us. Lord, help us to be people who quiet contention. Help us to be people who can live and work and operate in a political climate and encourage agreement around ideas. Encourage cooperation around causes that are important. Instead of it being, you're on that side, let it instead be, you know what, even though you're on that side and I'm on this side, can we agree that hungry kids is a problem? Can we agree that hunger is a problem? Okay, then let's quiet the anger over this issue, and let's instead have some agreement on this issue. Third thing that we have to do, we have to be careful with our spark. We have to bring down the heat, but we also have to remove the fuel. We have to remove the fuel. Proverbs 15:1 says this: a soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. A soft answer turns away wrath. See, that gentle answer can remove the fuel. Can remove the fuel. If you've ever been in a situation where you were angry over a misunderstanding, and the person answers the issue in a gentle way, it removes that fuel. It removes that fuel. I hear this. I've seen this a lot in my house in the last couple of weeks. A couple of weeks ago, a couple of my daughters had COVID, and one of them had some swelling in her ear and could just barely hear. And I talk loud. I was raised in a family with 3 older sisters. I talk loud. That and a lifestyle of being around power tools and V8 engines. I don't hear that well myself, so I talk loud. And so when she couldn't hear well, it didn't bother me at all because she was just not telling me that I was talking loud. All right. But when her siblings would talk to her, what did you say? I said this. Oh, okay. Wait, what did you say? I just said, do you want some lunch? Oh, I thought you were talking bad about my posture. Right, what? And there was just like this constant opportunity for misunderstanding. And the only reason that there weren't fires among them was that they were practicing gentle answers. There's an understanding. There was a misunderstanding. You didn't understand me. You're not hearing well. Maybe I didn't speak clearly. One of my favorite things to hear is a senior adult couple disagree over the issue of hearing. Like I know some of you may be there, and I know that it's real serious, but like it is the cutest thing in the world to hear some elderly lady say, "You can't hear," and to hear him say back, "You mumble." I love it. I love it. It's the cutest thing in the world. I can't wait to hear. Oh, anyway, to not be able to hear my wife. That didn't come out right. Didn't come out right at all. It's so great. But the thing is what's so great about it is that, you can't hear. You mumble. But when there's that soft answer, there's still peace. There's still peace. That gentle answer, you can't hear, you mumble, I love you too. That soft answer, it pushes away wrath. It removes the fuel when we have confrontation and it's met with a gentle answer. Let me do this before we go. I want to take just a few minutes here to talk a little bit about how it is maybe a few situations where this idea of a gentle answer is really important, and it's sort of sometimes where it almost doesn't matter. There are 3 instances where conversation doesn't work. I've done quite a bit of study on psychology, counseling, and neuroscience over the past few years, and there are, generally speaking, 3 instances where science says that in your brain, the lower part of your brain just kind of short circuits your ability to reason. And when someone's in a state like that, it almost doesn't do any good to talk to them. One is when a person is overwhelmed. When a person is overwhelmed, they've got so many things going on, there is such chaos, there is such disorder that it doesn't do any good to talk to them. If you remember, some of you were dealing with children coming through Hurricane Harvey. Some of you were in a situation where you're looking at all of your possessions underwater, and there wasn't a lot of opportunity to carefully reason and discuss things. You kind of just go into a survival mode. The scriptures point to this. In the story of when Elijah is facing the prophets of Baal, after the conflict is over and he is fleeing, he goes and he's off by himself, and he is overwhelmed at the prospects of water happening. He's overwhelmed by the things that he has seen and heard and done, and God doesn't in that moment take opportunity to teach him, to guide him. He just says, have a snack, take a nap. He gives him rest. He gives him space. You and I, when we are dealing with people in relationships, and it's hard to see sometimes, but there are going to be times when you see a person who is completely overwhelmed. And when you're dealing with someone who is overwhelmed, they may need some space. They may need some time. Or they might just need to know you're present, but then is not the time to have an argument, a disagreement. In a situation like that, a person is much more likely to snap, much more likely to have their anger flare up. The second instance is when a person is numb. When a person is numb, and there are situations where people are dealing with so many things, and maybe often it proceeds that when a person is overwhelmed for so long that eventually they reach a point of numbness. Sometimes a response to a personal loss, a death in the family, is that you feel numb. We see an example of that in Job sitting in mourning and ashes. We see the response of his friends. We see that in David as he loses his son, and he is sitting there for days as his son is at death's door. His infant newborn son is at death's door, and he is sitting there for days. And the best counselors in all of the world, the best counselors in all of the land, the wisest men through all of Egypt, they go to him and they try to reason with him, and he wants none of it. He doesn't want to listen. He can't listen to them. He's numb. And even after the baby passes, he takes that news and he says, okay. He washes his face, he gets dressed, and he goes to bed. He's numb. Sometimes there are going to be people that, and this may be where you are. You may be there this morning. You may feel numb. It's okay. It's all right to be numb. That's part of how God made us. God made us so that at a certain point, if you're too overwhelmed, if there's too much going on, there's something in your brain that just kind of switches off. And it's just going to be that way for a little while. I think the other instance is that when someone is explosively angry. Someone is explosively angry. I hope this has never happened to you. I know I've seen it depicted in movies quite often where people are in an argument and they're fighting, and one person says, I have to get away. And then, often there's a scene where, he goes away or she goes away and he lets her go, but then he comes back and then they meet and it's raining and there's a sunset and they kiss. Ryan Gosling is always in that movie. I'm not sure why. But there's that happens though, right? Where it's like, I just need space. And if that ever happens in your life, you may say, well, do I allow the space or do I go? Well, let me just say this. If they're overwhelmed, allow the space. If they're numb, allow a little space. If they're explosively angry, give that person a little time. Give that person a little time. Because explosive anger, it comes out. I think when you look in the Old Testament, we see Saul as a person who really struggled with explosive anger. In fact, the very first real story we have of Saul in his role as a king is that he gets bad news and he immediately kills his own ox. He immediately kills his own ox and chops it to pieces and sends this message out almost like a death threat to the tribes of Israel. I mean, whoa. And Saul never becomes the king that he ought to have been. He never becomes the king that David would be. Even though Saul had a much better lead into being king, even though he had a much greater opportunity early on than David had, who was having to fight his way to the throne, Saul never becomes the king that David would be because that anger is there throughout his time as king. So we have to be careful that in these times when we see people who are overwhelmed or numb or explosively angry, in instances like that, we especially need to be careful that we practice what we see in James chapter 1, verse 19. In James it says, "Know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger." Because if a person's overwhelmed, and you go and you sit with them and you just listen, they will love you for it. If a person is numb and they know that they are feeling something but they can't even give it a name, when they know that there's this feeling but they are having a hard time really even feeling anything right now, if you can sit there and listen to them as they grope with that, if you can listen to it, they will love you for it. If you can be around someone who is explosively angry, and just hear them, they'll love you for it. It'll turn away wrath. It will put off dissension. It will do good things for you, for them, for your relationship. This is hard. And I know that I've presented this and maybe you're like, well, that's real simple. I don't think any of us are going to ever be angry again. You're going to. I'm going to. God made us with powerful emotions. And learning to rein those emotions in is a work of discipline. It's a work of great effort that we have to practice every day. We need to make sure that every day we're thinking, okay, what am I hot about? What are the things that make me hot? What is the fuel that's stacking up in this relationship or in that relationship? What are the sparks that might happen today? If we can be aware of those things, then we will become disciplined to the point that people will look at you and say, oh, she doesn't have a temper. He doesn't have a temper. And you'd say, oh, but if you knew me in my younger days, if you knew me before God had refined me into this, if you knew me before the Spirit took hold of my heart and made these changes. That's the promise that's there for us. The promise is there for us that as children of God, as followers of Jesus, that there is a way to have anger and not sin. I hope that that is something that you want for your life. I can't say that necessarily is, but let me say this, because sometimes people really relish their anger. Sometimes people, I think they view their anger like a superpower. Like, oh, when I get angry, man, I'm smarter, I'm faster, I can be meaner and tougher. It's not. You may be in a relationship with somebody that really relishes that anger, that passion. You might enjoy it, but the people in your life don't. long term, the people in your life, they don't want that fire all the time. They don't want to have to live with the risk of saying the wrong thing and having combustion. They want peace. They want calm. And so I hope that you will right now accept this as a challenge to be careful with your sparks, to bring down the heat, and to remove fuel, to be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to anger. Let's pray together. Most gracious Father, we thank you for today. Lord, I thank you that you not only have given us this advice in Scripture, you've not only pointed to the promise of what life can be like when we follow your word, but that you have given us examples throughout the word of people who followed and were blessed, people who disobeyed and dealt with the wreckage. Lord, I pray that you would help us to be people that would accept your wisdom, that we would dwell in it, that we would let this idea of controlling these emotions rather than letting the emotions control us, that we would let that sit with us. We would take this seriously, that we would find out those places where there's heat, that we would be careful with the spark, and that we would, in all of our relationships, try to remove the Lord, I pray that if there's any here that doesn't know you this morning, that doesn't know that supernatural peace that only you can bring, I pray that your Spirit would move now, that today might be the day of salvation for them. And Lord, there may be some here this morning that are dealing with anger, that have been dealing with an explosive temper, and maybe your Spirit is dealing with them right now. Lord, I pray that into this day today they might commit to taking seriously the work of dealing with their anger. I pray that you would put them in relationships with people who would help them work through it. Lord, I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. We're going to have a time of invitation. Stand as you're able. If there's a commitment that you need to make, a decision that you need to walk through, I'll be here to talk.